Well, I'm still teaching through Matthew, still going through his section 6 as I have outlined his gospel. And I've called section 6 of Matthew, Jesus pronounces judgment against Israel and its leaders. Because once you see Jesus start to do things in Jerusalem, it all very much has that kind of condemnatory tone as he tells this nation once and for all what is wrong with them in several different ways. Now, this first portion where we've been of section 6, I've given its own title. I've called this The Divine King Openly Observed. And so this is mainly focusing around his entrance into Jerusalem and also what he does in the temple when he gets into Jerusalem. And I consider this a kind of prelude to his later declarations of judgment, in that he's sort of revealing more of himself for what he is. I guess you could say it's giving his credentials for making these judgments he's about to make, just showing his divine kingship more openly than he has heretofore in his ministry. He's saying and doing a lot of things that would normally be reserved just for the disciples, but now he is showing himself more evidently to the whole nation. So, in all of that, we've come to an event that I have called Jesus' attack on the temple, which I think is a little more accurate than the cleansing of the temple, as it's normally called. But it's these verses here in Matthew 21, verses 12 through 13, where we read this. It says, Jesus entered the temple and drove out all those who were buying and selling in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And he said to them, It is written, My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a robber's den. I am still fighting through the remnants of my cold, so my voice is going to be a little difficult still. But that's where we are today, and I've done 2 messages on this passage so far. Today is going to be the last message in my mini-series on this. And today's sermon I have called simply, Jesus Judges the House of God, because I believe ultimately this attack on the temple really is a kind of judgment on the temple. Now, I would like you to remember that emphasis on judgment. Be sure it does not slip your mind that I consider this to be an act of judgment on the temple, because I have a few strange things to say today about this passage. And as always happens whenever a preacher says something kind of strange, usually that gets mistaken for the main point, whereas the main point is actually something else. So just bear in mind as you hear everything I'm saying today, I'm all bringing it toward this one point to showing you that this attack on the temple is in itself an act of judgment. When Jesus starts tossing tables and chairs and chasing people around and causing a general panic, I want you to see his actions as a kind of visible prediction of what would happen 40 years later when the Romans would orchestrate a much greater attack on the temple and cause a much greater panic. And of course, I'm referring to the event in the year AD 70, when the Romans overwhelmed the defenses of Jerusalem during their rebellion and very much massacred Jews and tore down the city and tore down the temple and burned it and caused all kinds of awful things to happen in that city. I want you to see Jesus' actions here as a kind of visible prediction of what was going to happen not too long from this point in history. So, calling this message, Jesus Judges the House of God, in order to flag that for you as my main point. Now, I have 5 divisions for my sermon today. 2 of these are just review before we get into the actual content for today. First, I'll review my first message, which was giving you the 3 pieces of background information that I gave you to help you understand a few things that I wanted you to know. And then secondly, I'll review my second message in this series, in which I made the point that the people of God must have the righteousness of God to enjoy the house of God. And that sermon was, of course, based on the prophets that Jesus quotes when he speaks here in verse 13. And then when we get to my third point for today, this is where we get into actual new content. I want to try to refute a very common but very wrong way of reading this passage, which is where we get into the strange stuff I mentioned I was going to be saying. So I have to undo what I consider to be a wrong way of reading the passage. And then fourthly, I will argue that the anger of Jesus is directed against the people who interfere with the worship of God. So I see this passage as showcasing a great distraction to true worship and the way Jesus deals with that and the way Jesus responds to that. And then finally, I will prove that this interference with the worship of God brought certain judgment upon Israel. That this kind of thing that Jesus opposes here is what would bring about that greater calamity later on with the judgment of God falling on Jerusalem through the Romans. So that's a lot to cover in this message today, and some of it is just review of what we've seen already, but still a lot of ground to cover. Now, if there's any point of application for this, I want you guys to know this so you don't lose that in all the shuffle of things I'm talking about today. If there's any point of application for this message, it is the need to make sure that our own worship of God is conducted in a manner which portrays God as worthy of our total focus, which is mainly just to say, when you worship God, be sure your heart is actually in it and undistracted from anything else. Jesus famously said in John chapter 4, when he was talking with that Samaritan woman at the well, that God must be worshiped in spirit and truth. And that's a very open-ended statement, and there's a lot we can hang on that, but the general idea is that worship must always be done in spirit and truth. And then later on, of course, the Apostle Paul has his very famous statement about how the worship of God should be conducted, saying it should be done in order rather than in confusion. To those very common statements, we need to add what Jesus does here in this passage, because I believe it functions in the same basic line of thought in telling people how their worship ought to be conducted whenever they come before the Lord. I think what Jesus does here is perhaps a more dynamic and memorable way of conveying those same ideas that he was trying to convey with the Samaritan woman, and also what Paul was trying to say later about the orderliness of worship that is necessary. If our conduct in worship does not portray God as worthy of our utmost focus, we commit a sin worthy of a response like Jesus' attack on the temple, or worse. When you see these things Jesus does, and when you hear what they represent coming for Israel later on, I want you to remember that for your own worship of God, and remember that God really is worthy of your utmost focus, and God does enforce his worthiness to your uttermost focus. God is very interested in making sure that those who worship him really do worship in spirit and truth, and in order rather than confusion. Jesus goes into the temple and does these things to remind us of that. So that is what I want you to remember for your own lives as we hear these things today. So let's begin our study by reviewing some of the things we saw at the first. I want to begin my first division here by reviewing some of that background material that I had in mind in my first message. 3 pieces of background information that are helpful for working through this passage. The first piece of background information, which I gave you in my first sermon, was about the similar story recorded in chapter 2 of John's Gospel. Where we went over there, we read that story. We saw Jesus similarly attacking the temple there at the beginning of John's Gospel. And here we are at the end of Matthew, and also we could throw the end of Mark and the end of Luke in there, where we see a very similar story. Now, I said that similar story recorded by John is indeed helpful for understanding this event here in Matthew, whether or not John records the same exact event. Now, on the one hand, it is simply not clear whether John does describe the same event as Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's possible they are definitely very similar. The fact that they occur in different places in their histories of Jesus isn't too big of a deal to some degree, because we see stuff like that happen in the other Gospels where they move things around based on what topics they want to deal with, how they want to present Jesus. But at the same time, it's a very big difference, probably one of the biggest differences that we would see between the 4 Gospels. So that does make some Christians uneasy in calling it all the same thing. So it's really not clear whether they are the same exact event, but one thing that is clear is that they are the same kind of event. Both in John chapter 2 and in Matthew, Mark, and Luke at the end of their Gospels when Jesus enters Jerusalem. They're both recording the same kind of event. Jesus going into the temple of Jerusalem, seeing things he doesn't like, going in there and forcibly disrupting everything he doesn't like, and making some statement about the wrongness of what they're doing. Very, very similar, certainly the same kind of event. Therefore, because they're the same kind of event, we can make observations from John's account which can help us understand Matthew's account. You can actually cross-reference them and compare them to each other and get insight from one passage about the other, even if they're not exactly the same event. They are the same kind of event, which makes comparison possible. And I think that's an important observation because I actually will appeal to John's Gospel later on in this sermon. I actually do have a point to make from John chapter 2, which I think will help us somewhat in understanding Matthew. So that's why I wanted to delve a little bit into John chapter 2 and the similar story there. The second piece of background information I had for you from my first sermon was about the word robber. And I spent a great amount of time belaboring this point, and I also did some things in my second sermon targeting that word robber and its meaning and its implications. Now, my point originally was just to remember that we have to carefully understand this word robber. And the point that I made at the first was simply that robbers are not just thieves, they are actually violent thieves. There is a strong tone of violence in the very word robbery and in the conduct of robbers. Now, this violent activity, as I went on to say, is what prevents robbers from being in normal society. They have to go live in robbers' dens. They have to go find caves or other secret hideaways where they can live because they know that they can't just live in towns. The people of the town don't want them there. So these people are very much held at bay by the rest of society. They say, get out of our town. And so robbers are very much living off by themselves on their own. And since robbers live separate from society, neither law nor manners will restrain their wickedness. Robbers, because they are on their own and because they are already delving into some very deep sins, see fit to do basically whatever they want, whenever they want, whatever kind of sin it may be. And therefore, robbers represent the most reprobate portion of society. And that is something that that is the point that I really wanted to drive home from taking this sort of focus on stealing into violence, into their separation from society, into this whole idea that these people, these robbers, represent just the most high-handedly wicked kind of people that you can meet. So that image of the robber as the practitioner of wild, high-handed sin is what's going to inform Jesus' use of that word in this passage. And we'll get to more of that later in this sermon, but I just want to remind you here that when Jesus talks about robbers and a robber's den and all that, I think it is an image of unrestrained wickedness. That is primarily what I think he has in mind in talking about robbers. So that is a piece of background information you certainly need to have. The final piece of background information from that first sermon was simply about the overwhelming authority of Jesus, especially as you see it displayed in this passage where he goes into this temple and attacks it and is not at all hindered. And the question I was trying to ask in that sermon when I was dealing with this was, why does nobody stop Jesus from wrecking the temple? I talked about how normally if someone did a thing like this, someone would try to stop him. There was even a police force there in the temple of Levites who were patrolling the temple, as they often did. There was a Roman fort built over the temple looking down in the temple, and they were quite willing on other occasions to intervene in matters going on in the temple to keep order. So why is Jesus allowed to do basically whatever he wants when he enters that temple? Well, I explained that Jesus' attack on the temple is a display of his own overwhelming authority. The fact that the very presence of this man, the way he conveys himself, had a way about it to where people just did not interfere with what Jesus was doing. Jesus, being the blameless Son of God and the incarnation of truth, always had such an appearance and presence of authority around him that no one was ever able to stop him from doing anything until God's appointed time for him to die. Until the time when God intended this, And when Jesus gave himself over to it, until that time, no one can touch him, just because of his overwhelming authority. You see this man and you say to yourself, I'm not messing with him. That is what is conveyed in the presence of Jesus on this occasion and others, and that was my explanation for why he just goes in there and is completely unhindered in his ransacking of the temple. And all of that was simply background information for understanding some of these other things we're going to be talking about today, for the most part. Now, my second message that I did in this series was targeting the prophetic passages that Jesus quotes here in verse 13 whenever he orchestrates his attack on the temple. And in my second message, which I also want to review here, I made the point that the people of God must have the righteousness of God to enjoy the house of God. And it's that idea in the mind of Jesus that drives him to some degree to go into this temple and make this strong statement by forcibly injecting himself into what the people are doing there that he finds so wrong. The people of God must have the righteousness of God to enjoy the house of God. Now, my sermon was based on two phrases quoted by Jesus here in verse 13, where he says, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a robber's den." There are two phrases there from two different prophets. One of those phrases is from Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 11. And we studied that passage. The phrase quoted by Jesus is where Jeremiah says, "Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your sight?" So that's the phrase quoted by Jesus. And from that passage in Jeremiah, we learned that even the presence of the house of God there in Jerusalem could not save Israel from the judgment of God. We talked about how they were making a mess of things in their lives and in the temple in Jeremiah's day, how Jeremiah gives that prophetic warning, and how that calamity did fall on Jerusalem in the days of Jeremiah when the Babylonians came in and attacked the city and burned down that temple that was there at that time. So even the presence of the house of God does not protect people from judgment of God if they fall into wickedness. Now, the other phrase quoted by Jesus is from Isaiah chapter 56, verse 7. And the phrase that Jesus quotes from Isaiah is, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the peoples." So this is one of the many glorious promises that Isaiah makes on behalf of God for Israel in the last part of his book. In this case, the house there, the temple there in Jerusalem would someday become a house of prayer for all nations, not just Israel, but the whole world gathered there to worship before the Lord. And from that passage in Isaiah, we learn that God did have a glorious plan for his house, including all the nations, in spite of his willingness to disregard his own house in acts of judgment. God has often been willing to do that, to bring judgment upon his own house for the wickedness that he finds there. But in spite of all that, God's plan moves forward. It is a glorious plan, and someday that house shall be a house of prayer for all the nations. All of that in my second message, all of that trying to present Jesus' motivations, what's going through his mind as he carries out his attack on the temple. Now, I also said as part of all that, there were two truths kind of running through those passages that I also wanted you to remember, and which are also in the mind of Christ at this time. First, that God always cares less about ritual and more about righteousness. He cares more about the conduct of people than all of the go here and say this and do these things at this time that usually falls into our acts of worship. In the days of Jeremiah, people carried on with the rituals of the temple well enough. They were there in the temple. It's not like Jeremiah went to the temple to preach and found it empty. There were plenty of people trying to worship God in the temple on that day. The problem was they lacked righteousness. They were acting like a bunch of robbers, as Jeremiah told them, and that was the problem. And since God cares more about the righteousness than the ritual, they were in trouble. Also in the Isaiah passage, he begins his oracle there with a plea for true righteousness. Do justice and preserve righteousness, he says, because that is how you actually get to enjoy this glorious plan that God had in store. It wasn't for everyone. It was only for those who repented of sin and pursued true righteousness. Because God cares more about the righteousness than the ritual happening there in that temple. Now, the second truth to remember, also running through those prophetic passages and also going through the mind of Jesus on that occasion in Jerusalem, the second truth to remember is God will not allow His promises to be used as excuses for sin, which is unfortunately the primary use of the promises of God among most people. They very much bank on God's promises and God's overtures of love that He makes to people and His desire to make known that He is a loving and gracious God. Most people just take that and abuse it. They use it to reinforce their own sinfulness. They say, well, if God has promised this, that, and the other, then I can do whatever I want. Well, God isn't going to go for that. Jeremiah condemned his generation for using the house of God as a kind of shield against the judgment of God. They very much thought that because the temple of the Lord was there in Jerusalem, they were safe from all judgment. And Jeremiah told them that was not the case. The shield failed simply because God is not so stupid as to be tricked by that. God knows when sinners are making abusive misuse of His promises, and God will deal with that. As for Isaiah, he states that God does have great promises for His house for those who will pray there. However, righteousness is once again held forth as the requirement for being able to enjoy that promise. You know, if you're not a righteous person when God begins to do those things, God will still keep His promise. It's just you will not enjoy those promises. You will not be there. This is again only for those who repent of their sin and actually begin to live lives worthy of God. Now, Matthew, as he records his event here, Jesus' attack on the temple, as he records these things, he presents these prophetic passages as the motivation for Jesus' attack. These are the things Jesus says when He gets done turning over those tables. He quotes from these two prophets to explain His actions. So Jesus is very much motivated by this idea that the people of God must have the righteousness of God to enjoy the house of God. All of that is in His mind as He confronts Israel in this way on this occasion. All right, so that's review of my first two messages. And you would think that after all of that, I might finally be ready to preach what I really want to preach when it comes to this passage. Unfortunately, there is one more thing I have to do before I can move into my actual point about this attack on the temple. The first thing I need to do is refute a wrong way of viewing the passage. This is a way that is very common, but I do not think it is correct, and I'm sure it's going to be in your minds, and I need to make sure that it is out of your minds before I get to talking about what I want to say. So I have to deal with that. So here's what I'm going to say. For the record, Stan Choate, on camera, saying this, being recorded, I do not think that the anger of Jesus is directed against a practice we might call price gouging. And that's kind of a slang term for it, but that's the phrase that I find myself using as I think about it. Price gouging. Now, the younger people in the audience may need some help understanding that phrase and what I mean by it. So, you know, when you need to get something, you normally need to buy it. You have to get your money and go somewhere where someone's selling it and go buy that thing that you need to get. You do it all the time when you go to the store. I'm sure you've accompanied your parents to the store to buy things. You got to go buy these things you need. And you also know probably that sometimes the things you want to buy cost more money than you want to pay. Maybe some of you children have been saving up money for a toy, and you have to save up more money than you really want to because, hey, that's really expensive. Why do they charge so much for that? Why does it cost so much? You got to save up so much money to get this thing that you want. It costs more than you'd really like to pay for it. But sometimes, maybe it's something you actually need. Maybe it's not a toy or this thing or that thing. Maybe it's something you actually need to buy. No matter how much it costs, you have to get it, which means you have to pay the money to get that thing. Now, here's the thing. If you've not learned this yet, you should learn it now because you're going to deal with it all your life. If the person selling you this thing knows that you need it and knows that you will pay anything to get it, they will raise the price on you. It will happen. If they know you need this and they know you'll pay whatever it takes to get it, they're going to scratch off the price tag and they're going to write a higher number on there because they know you need it and they know you'll pay anything to get it. I mean, that's just how it works. That is, if you get into buying and selling and those kinds of things, you're going to deal with that sort of practice. And that practice is what we normally call, or sometimes call, price gouging. You might just say inflating the prices, raising the price on something. You might call it by any of those terms, but usually price gouging is the term that shows our frustration. It's like, oh, I can't believe all this. Can't believe he's making me pay this much money. But that's what people do. Now, I've bothered to explain that to you because a great many Christians think that Jesus is angry in the temple here because he sees price gouging, he sees inflated prices here in all this buying and selling in the temple. Let's just read it again here to get the passage in front of us. It says, "And Jesus entered the temple and drove out all of those who were buying and selling in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves." So you have all this buying and selling going on here in the temple. And many Christians think that Jesus is angry in the temple because he sees that kind of price gouging. You see people selling animals to use for sacrifices and things like that. You see people buying them. And a lot of Christians suppose that with all this exchanging of money going on, that there are some inflated prices. People selling a sheep for this much money when it really only costs this much, because they know these people need to buy animals for their sacrifices. So all these merchants are, upping the prices on them, really using the opportunity to make more money than they should be making at the expense of others. A lot of people think that's what Jesus sees in the temple, that's what makes him angry, and that's what causes him to start flipping over tables and driving people out. A lot of Christians read the passage that way. I myself do not think that's what Jesus has in mind. I do not think that's what is making Jesus angry on this occasion. I don't think that price gouging or inflated prices, or whatever you want to call it, is the cause of Jesus' anger on this occasion. However, I do understand why Christians think that. I don't mean to create the impression that it's an outlandish idea. After all, it's so common that most people just sort of assume that as they read the passage, that Jesus is angry about unfair business practices happening there in the temple. I understand why Christians think this. First of all, I would say this is actually, here in the temple, this is the perfect opportunity for price gouging if it ever were to happen. I mean, you have people coming in there to sacrifice animals, but they can't just bring all their animals in there. Some of these people have traveled from a long distance away. They just brought money with them and they came to buy their sacrifice. Well, they need to make that sacrifice. They need that lamb. They need that cow. They need all this stuff to sacrifice with. And the people doing the selling probably rubbed their hands together and said, hey, we can up the prices on these people because we know they need this stuff. It was probably happening. In fact, if I were going to do that, I could show you some selections from Jewish literature from this period in which they talk about things like that happening. So it seems like there is even evidence that it was happening. So I understand it's probably the perfect scenario for all this kind of thing, and yeah, it was probably happening. Furthermore, and this is the point that a lot of people really latch on to when they talk about this, furthermore, Jesus does use the word robbery to describe what he sees here in this temple. You're making my Father's house a den of robbers, he says. And so most people, when they think of robbers, they think first of stealing. And most people, when they hear about price gouging or inflated prices, they consider that to be a form of stealing. They might even say some less flattering things than that about it. So a lot of people, when they see this word robbery, they just sort of assume that it's related to unfair business practices with the buying and the selling happening there in the temple. So for all those reasons, I understand why Christians come to this passage and think that Jesus is angry because he sees super high prices being charged for these sacrifices and things that people need to buy. I understand why Christians think that. I just think it's wrong. I just think it's not what Jesus has in mind here when he comes into the temple and gets all angry about things. I see three main objections to viewing price gouging as the chief cause of concern here in the passage. 3 objections. First objection is that John's account does not mention robbery. And this is where I make my appeal to John chapter 2 that I hopefully prepared you for in my first message. This is where I said I was going to appeal to something in John chapter 2. And that's why I did this. I wanted to make this argument here from John. Whenever John portrays at least a similar story, the same kind of event, I want you to read this passage with me. John chapter 2, verse 13 through 17. And let's see if we can find the word robbery in the passage. It says, "The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And he found in the temple those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves and the money changers seated at their tables. And he made a scourge of cords," or a whip of cords, right? A whip of cords, and he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And to those who were selling the doves, he said, "Take these things away and stop making my Father's house a place of business." Then his disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Okay, so in this passage we see the same kind of event. Jesus going into the temple, seeing all this buying and selling, not being pleased at all with what he sees, and just making a mess of everything in righteous indignation. We see the same kind of story. But did you notice in this passage, Jesus makes no accusation about robbery? I told you to watch for that word. That word isn't there. Stealing isn't there. Any kind of word like that isn't there. Instead, Jesus makes a complaint about business. He says, "Stop making my Father's house a place of business." Some translations say merchandise. Same basic idea, buying and selling stuff. Merchandise is what you buy and sell. So, it seems to me that the very presence of buying and selling in the temple is what has made him angry. No matter what the prices were, no matter if there was price gouging or some other form of stealing, any kind of dishonest business practice, none of that actually matters. It's not dishonest business, it's just business. It's the business taking place in the temple that bothers Jesus. So that's my first objection to thinking that it's inflated prices or something like that that has Jesus angry. My second objection also has to do with the word robbery, and I think you should expect what I have to say by now, but just in case I want to say it all plainly so you all have it in your mind, I want to remind you that robbery, once again, is more than stealing, and this idea of the den of robbers has more to it than just the act of stealing from people. This is why I spent so much time in my first 2 messages talking about robbers and the implications of being a robber and the connotations that go with the word robbery and a den of robbers. Many Christians, again, when they see the word robber and the robber's den here, they just think, okay, stealing. Must be some kind of unfair business practice. Must be price gouging or something like that. Well, my point was that robbers are more than just thieves. They aren't people that quietly steal from other people who do it in secret to where they might escape notice, where they can live a seemingly normal life in a town or a city somewhere and just steal secretly and get away with it. That's not what a robber is. Robbers actually represent the most reprobate portion of society. They steal, they kill in order to steal, they work such great wickedness that they have to leave society and go live out in secret in their dens. And for that reason, they are completely unrestrained by society, by its laws and by its manners, and they become really a byword for the most reprobate portion of society. And Jeremiah, I think, targets this in the passage quoted by Jesus in this passage here in Matthew. Let me read what Jeremiah writes again. This is the phrase quoted by Jesus when he talks there in the temple. Let's read Jeremiah 7, verses 9 through 11, and see how Jeremiah uses this image of the den of robbers. It says here, verse 9, let's see here. He says, "Will you steal, murder, and commit adultery, and swear falsely, and offer sacrifices to Baal, and walk after other gods that you have not known? Then come and stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say, 'We are delivered,' that you may do all these abominations? Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your sight? Behold, I, even I, have seen it, declares the Lord. Now, Jeremiah's description of these people's sins is a lot more than classical robbery, right? It's more than just stealing and murdering. He does mention those sins, but he mentions committing adultery. He mentions swearing falsely. He mentions worshiping other gods. He mentions the hypocrisy of the temple. He mentions all kinds of stuff that isn't just robbery. He mentions really every form of wickedness that you can think of, all the high-handed forms of evil. And he summarizes all that by saying this place has become like a den of robbers. It's become like a bunch of people who don't care about any law, don't care about manners of any kind, don't care about anything in society. That's what you've turned the temple into. It's become like a den of robbers. So robbery is more than just stealing, especially as Jeremiah uses the word. As he uses the word, it becomes a symbol for all forms of great wickedness. And Jeremiah's use of the word is what informs Jesus' use of the word, because Jesus is quoting Jeremiah. It's all one thing. If anything, Jesus uses the phrase robber's den to describe the temple in such a way as to make it seem like a place where all manner of sin is being practiced. It's not just price gouging. It's not just jacking up the prices. It's not just, having scales that don't work properly when you weigh out people's money. It's not just those things. The den of robbers refers to a place where you just see all kinds of sin. And it's just awful to behold. That stands behind his great display of anger when he says those phrases, this place has become like a den of robbers. So that's my second objection. Robbery is not just stealing. It's not just going to refer to unfair business practices. When you call this place a den of robbers, you're saying everyone here is acting in a way so wicked that they belong in the company of robbers. It is a place of unrestrained wickedness. That's my second objection to the common way of reading this passage. I do have a third objection, which I consider to be my main objection. So this is the one that I would really put forward to you as something worthy of your consideration. If you feel like I've been maybe going kind of here and there, not really seeing my point, this I think is the one that really opened my eyes to it. So here's the big one. Jesus does not merely condemn the sellers, but also the buyers. The buyers also fall under Jesus' condemnation. Look again at how Matthew writes the passage. He gives a list of people that catch the wrath of Jesus on this occasion. He lists 4 groups of people. Let's see who's listed number 1. Who's the number 1 baddie? Who's the number 1 malefactor on this occasion? Verse 12, Jesus entered the temple and drove out all those who were buying. First item on the list. It's like he didn't go after the sellers first. He didn't go after the guys selling doves. Didn't go after the money changers first. He went after the buyers first. Now I find that amazing because if the sin he sees in the temple is some kind of unfair business practice, doesn't that make the buyers the victims? Aren't they the people being sinned against? Wouldn't Jesus be standing up for them? Wouldn't he be the champion of the buyers on this occasion? If the problem in the temple is price gouging or something like that, the buyers wouldn't be listed among the sinners. They wouldn't be listed among those people being driven out of the temple. Jesus wouldn't be angry at them. Whatever Jesus sees here happening in this account, whatever Jesus sees here happening at this time in the temple, it's a sin that's also present in the buyers. It's not just the sellers that are sinning, the buyers are sinning somehow too. So it's not just jacking up the prices. There's something else happening here in the temple beyond that that has Jesus angry. So for all those reasons, for those 3 objections that I just gave you, I do not think price gouging or anything like that is the reason Jesus is angry on this occasion. I think that's a very wrong way of reading the passage, even if it is very common. Which now makes you ask the question, okay, what is happening in this passage? Why is Jesus angry? Why has this situation prompted him to clear things out and give this prophetic style condemnation on the temple here? Well, here we come to my 4th division for this sermon. I think the anger of Jesus is directed against people who interfere with the worship of God. So in a time and in a place when God is being worshiped and should be worshiped and ought to be worshiped, you have people who are getting in the way of all that and distracting people from the worship of God, and that is what has Jesus so angry on this occasion. Can you imagine trying to worship God in any way while all that buying and selling is going on around you? Just try to imagine the scene there in the temple with all these people doing their buying and selling, and you come from some far distant part of the nation hoping to worship God in some way that you can only really do in the temple, whether it's through sacrifices or hearing the choir there. It's not really a choir, but hearing the singing that was often going on there, or hearing the rabbis, the famous rabbis that might be there doing some of their teaching. Any of the ways that God is worshipped in that temple, any of those ways. You're there to do those things. Imagine trying to do those things in the middle of all that buying and selling. Can you imagine trying to listen to my sermon right now if we had a concession stand in the back of the room, people selling popcorn and drinks and candy bars and all this kind of stuff? Oh, I want this, I want this. Why are you out of that? Oh, this is awful. It's like, you imagine all that happening, all the stuff that you would see at a concession stand happening back there while I'm trying to preach. That'd be a madhouse. Can you imagine trying to conduct a prayer meeting in the middle of a farmer's market? Like going down to the town square where everyone's buying and selling the stuff that they've grown, and you're trying to have a prayer meeting in the middle of it, and everyone around you is bartering over prices and all that kind of thing. Well, that would be pretty annoying. That would be a huge distraction to you while you're trying to pray. Can you imagine trying to sing hymns over the noise of sheep and bulls and birds? Because in the temple, they were all right there. You got guys trying to sell those animals right there in the courtyard of the temple where all this other activity is supposed to be going on. Just so you know, the altar of burnt offering is right there in the courtyard. So this is where the priests are going through the most solemn of occasions, making atonement for sin, and there you are trying to enter into this time, trying to make this offering your atonement before the Lord. And in the middle of all that, you've got bad and mooing and all this stuff going on, trying to go through this solemn occasion with all this racket. This would be awful. The courtyard of that temple was a place where the faithful could meet from all over Israel, where the faithful could meet for the purest, most godly motives and practices. I mean, one of the highlights of your year was going to be going to the temple, if indeed you were a pious Jew. But none of that was possible in the middle of all this buying and selling. It's going to be a tremendous distraction for you. Impossible to enter into that time the way you ought to, with all that buying and selling. Now think about all the sin committed by means of that buying and selling. Think of this as actual wickedness. The buyer sins because he's thinking less about worshiping God and more about getting the best deal. All the things, if you can think about any occasion where you've been bartering for prices with somebody, I'm sure you've done it at some point, maybe, whether you like it or not. If you can imagine all the things going through your mind at that time, all the things you're trying to do, I guarantee you there's not much room in your head for anything else. Least of all, God and your efforts to worship God by presenting this offering to God later on. All that's been driven out of your mind as you sit there bartering over prices. The seller sins because he's thinking less about serving God's people and more about making money. Whether it's by price gouging or not, he's thinking about making as much money as he can in this situation and trying to sell more sheep than the guy next to him who's also selling sheep, and getting into a contest with people trying to, outbid and all that kind of thing. The seller has completely forgotten that he might be providing a service to worshipers. Now he's just trying to make money. And then the leaders. Think about the leaders of Israel who have charge over this temple, especially the priesthood, the chief priests, guys like Caiaphas at this time. Imagine their sinfulness in all this. The leaders in charge of the temple also sin because they allow such disregard for God to continue in the very house of God. They're the custodians of this place. You think they'd be trying to keep the worship of God pure. Instead, they have all these merchants in there and all this buying and selling and all this racket, and now no one can focus on why they are there. And all the while, every group I just mentioned sins against the faithful people who actually are trying to come there to worship God. They're sinning against those faithful people because they're distracting them from what they actually are trying to do. I mean, let's say you were putting some forethought into it. You decide not to buy your sacrifice there in the temple. You get your animal ahead of time, so you're pulling it in on a leash, trying to get in there to offer your sacrifice, trying to make this occasion as focused as you know how to make it, but still in the middle of it all, you've got the noise, you've got the commotion, you've got all the people angry because they couldn't get the best deal on that bull they were trying to buy. You've got this, that, and the other. You've just got chaos around you. You can't do what you're there to do. And it's because of all these other people there buying and selling, and because of the leaders of Israel who are allowing it. That is a great sin against you as a faithful worshiper of God in the middle of all this racket. And Jesus sees this, and he is enraged. He is angry at this happening. That is why Jesus, in John's account, opposes the very presence of business in the temple of God. It's not the stealing or the price gouging or anything like that. It's the very fact that there's merchandise, there's merchandising and all that kind of thing going on in the house of God. This is why Jesus, like Jeremiah, compares the whole assembly to a den of robbers, because they have abandoned all virtue and piety. You would think this is the one place where people would act appropriately, where they would act in a pious fashion. Even if their hearts are not right before God, they might act that way because this is a solemn place and a solemn occasion. But oh no, they just come in there trying to make a buck or a shekel or whatever denomination of money they're using. They're in there trying to make money or save money if they're the ones trying to buy. They're in there for those purposes and have totally forgotten just how holy this place is and how holy their conduct ought to be. So Jesus looks at them and says, you guys are a bunch of robbers. You've turned this place into a den of robbers all over again, just like Jeremiah said. And this is why Jesus drove out the buyers with the sellers. They're not the victims on this occasion. They're part of the problem. This is why Jesus turned over tables and chairs. This is why he went in there and started driving people out in his anger. The anger of Jesus is very much directed, I think, against people who are interfering with the worship of God. Now, I want to be sure that you are considering this as a matter of attention for your own worship of God. We've been talking a lot about the temple and things back then and the situations back then. And I know we don't have animals and things like that in here where we're trying to buy and sell animals for sacrifices and all that. But this is very relevant for you. This is very relevant for us as a church. I want to make sure you're thinking about this. So to that end, I would like to remind you of an earlier discussion that our church had, which is actually connected with this lesson. This was some time ago, although not very long ago, and it's an issue that we resolved, I think, very well, but it was a discussion we had. Some time ago, our church discussed how to manage the preparation of the meal during the meetings we have here, right? Because, we have a meal practically after every time we meet together, and that's a good thing. We think it's even a biblical thing from the New Testament. But with all the energy of that and all the work that goes into that, there are room for distractions. Distraction to the people preparing the meal, distractions to those of us out here. There is possibility for distraction. And the chief concern that Chad and I had at that time was to ensure that no one, especially the women preparing the meal, would be distracted during this time, during the time of singing and the time of the sermon, so that none of us would be distracted from the worship of God because of the meal being prepared back there. So to that end, Chad and I asked that certain practices be discarded or adopted to ensure that meal preparation would not distract from this time here of preaching and also of singing and sharing from the Word of God. So we did all that for the reason of preserving the worship of God against distraction. In hindsight, maybe you should all be thankful that Chad and I did not make our point by shattering crock pots and things like that. We went about it in a way that was a little less heavy-handed. Jesus was justified in what he did. Doing that on that occasion for us would probably be a bit too much. But we did something. We saw a problem, we saw distractions, and we tried to deal with it, and as a church, I feel like we dealt with that well, to the point where it has not really been a problem since that time. But that's the same kind of thing. When Jesus goes in there and sees all these distractions and just loses his temper entirely and tries to deal with it, it was because people were interfering with the worship of God. That was a big deal. God is worthy of worship and worthy of undistracted worship, and Jesus took action. And in the same way, in your own life or in this church, whenever you encounter any kind of distraction against the worship of God, you should take action. It should fill you with the same kind of righteous indignation that Jesus had on this occasion. You should pay special attention to your times of worship and make sure that nothing is getting in there that will interfere. And if you find something, you should drive it out, just like Jesus drove out these buyers and sellers. However, Israel had been doing that kind of thing for a long time, and I trust that they went back to doing it after Jesus was gone, because when he was not around anymore to enforce this, they're certainly going to go back to their sins, especially since they were the ones who caused him to die. So Israel did not reform according to what Jesus said, and of course they were walking in sin for a good long while, and for that reason, this interference with the worship of God brought certain judgment upon Israel. We can rightly say this is one of the reasons judgment fell upon Israel not too long after Jesus died, whenever the Romans eventually came and besieged the city of Jerusalem. Now, lest you think that Jesus was maybe overreacting to a briefly lived sin and that any judgment from God might be premature, I just want to say that Jesus was responding to a long-standing trend in misusing the house of God. This is not something that was happening just briefly there at that time. And whenever God came in judgment against Israel later on, that was not an overreaction either. This was a long-standing trend in Israel's history. Now, of course, we've seen some of this already. In my previous message, we already reviewed the sins of Eli's sons at the tabernacle in Shiloh, and the sins of Jeremiah's generation and their temple, the ways that those various groups of people were misusing the house of God and doing things that should not be done, especially there. We've seen all of that. We've talked about the judgment that fell at Shiloh. We talked about the judgment that eventually fell according to the prophecies of Jeremiah. We've talked about all of that. And you would think that Israel would have learned from all those times that God had judged his own house. You think they'd remember Shiloh. They'd remember the burning of Solomon's temple. You think they'd remember all of those things. But even after the nation returned from exile in Babylonia and rebuilt their temple and resumed temple worship, they still did not learn. We see these kinds of abuses of the temple all the way back in that period of history. Let me take you back to the book of Nehemiah. I won't be there long. Don't feel the need to turn there, but you can if you want to. It's Nehemiah chapter 13. Verse 4. Now this is, of course, after Israel returned from exile in Babylonia. They rebuild their temple. They resume temple worship. And hey, guess what? They start misusing the house of God again. Nehemiah 13, verse 4. Now prior to this, Eliashib the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, being related to Tobiah, had prepared a large room for him, where formerly they put the grain offerings and the frankincense, and the utensils and the tithes of grain, wine and oil prescribed for the Levites, the singers and the gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests. So get that. Here's this room where they were using to store sacrifices and equipment for the temple and provisions for the Levites and the priests. I mean, this room was being used for holy purposes. And at some point, the priest there said, clear all that out. Let's make a room for this friend of mine, Tobiah. It's like, oh yeah, that's really holy. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. Well, what does Nehemiah do? Well, during this time, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had gone to the king. After some time, however, I asked leave from the king, and I came to Jerusalem, and I learned about the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah by preparing a room for him in the courts of the house of God. It was very displeasing to me, using his understatement here. It was very displeasing to me. So I threw all of Tobiah's household goods out of his room. It's where this guy lives, right? I mean, he's living there. And Nehemiah just comes and throws his house out, basically. I threw out all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room. Then I gave an order, and they cleansed the room. And I returned the utensils of the house of God with the grain offerings and the frankincense. Okay, so certainly Nehemiah had reason to react so forcefully to that occasion. I mean, God avenges sin. Nehemiah knows that abuses of the temple of God like this caused national tragedies in the past. He knows this, and he knows you cannot let this happen again. So he gets back there in Jerusalem, he sees this happening in the temple, he says, nope, we're not going that road again. He goes in there and he clears everything out. It's very understandable. God avenges sin even if his house is there, and even especially if his house is there. So Nehemiah is not going to stand for this. So Nehemiah takes it as an opportunity to teach Israel a lesson about the proper use of the temple. You would think they would learn from that. You would think after Shiloh and the burning of Solomon's temple and Nehemiah's stunt there in his day, you would think after all of this history that Israel would learn. You would think my voice would be recovered by now, too. You would think Israel would learn from all of that. But they didn't learn. In the days of Jesus, hey, bring all the buying and selling into the temple. It's noisy in here. It doesn't matter. It's just convenient to have the sacrifices being sold here. Here they are, once again, making use of the temple in a way that hinders the worship of God. So Jesus responded much like Nehemiah did. Nehemiah starts throwing out all of Tobiah's stuff, all of his clothes and furniture and all of that. Jesus goes in and starts turning over tables, dumping out the money, chasing out the buyers and the sellers, all very similar for the same reasons. Because God cares about this. But just bear in mind, what Jesus did there in the temple on that day, it's just the tail end of this long-standing problem that Israel had had for a long time. Even in that very temple that was built when the Jews returned from Babylonia, where Nehemiah took it upon himself to cleanse one of the rooms there, even in that very place, you still have this kind of problem. This was a long-standing problem. Jesus was understandably fed up, and the judgment of God rightly fell on that eventually because of that long-standing trend toward wickedness in the temple. It is all very understandable. Now, all that to say, Jesus takes this opportunity to proclaim the certainty of judgment upon this house, right? Okay, now, Jesus goes in there, he turns over temples, he's chasing people out. You think that was quite a scene, but really it's just a foretaste of what's to come. You read later on in Matthew what Jesus says. You think turning over some tables is bad. Matthew 24, verses 1 through 2. Jesus came out from the temple and was going away with his disciples when his disciples came out to point out to him the temple buildings. And he said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." Jesus turned over tables. The Romans came and overturned the entire building. That's what they did about 40 years later, and many other terrible things. Now, we often connect that judgment that befell on Jerusalem at the hands of the Romans to the murder of Jesus, and rightly so. He was the Son of God. He was handed over purely out of envy from the leaders and because of disinterest in him by the nation, and all of that is right. Judgment rightly fell for that. But based on the way Jesus acts when he first enters Jerusalem and he first enters the temple, you get the idea that God was already planning to wreck his house because of what he saw there. And you get that idea because God in the flesh was already there wrecking his house. Jesus, as the divine Son of God, came to his own home, so to speak, saw what they were doing there, and just trashed the place. as a kind of foretaste of what was to come. So you get the idea that even before Israel turned against Jesus, in the day of his crucifixion, even before that, God was already angry enough to send an oracle of doom through the person of Jesus about his house, about the temple. I'm going to wrap this up because my voice is quickly failing me. But that is the point I really want to make here. These things happening in the temple, this distraction from the worship of God, that's what has Jesus angry. It merited judgment from God. Jesus gives a visible presentation of that judgment, a foretaste of it, when he starts turning over those tables. And anyone insightful enough to see those things and recognize the wrongdoing would have repented. But alas, most of the nation did not repent at the preaching of Jesus, and 40 years later, the full judgment actually fell. And that is how Jesus judges the house of God when he goes in there. So, once again, just to give a brief summary of points from today, I don't think it's price gouging or anything like that that has Jesus angry. I think it's the distraction to worship that he sees. That's what makes him angry, and that is what merited an act of judgment from God for those things. So let's remember this for our own lives. Let's remember how seriously God takes his worship. Let's remember, most of all, how worthy God is of that worship. And let's have hearts that befit that whenever we come before God. And let's make sure we ourselves are undistracted in our times of worship. I will try to field questions or comments at this time with the last bit of water I have left in this bottle. Does anyone have questions or comments at this time?